All right, hi everyone. Welcome back. So, I am assuming now you've already watched Los Olvidados. I think you probably found it to be a rather powerful film, a real gut punch with a tragic ending. Let's take a closer look at the film and let's figure out what makes it tick. So, I mentioned in my introductory lecture that Buñuel uses elements of the surreal in this film to help amplify and make more convincing the use of realism or a form even of neorealism in the film. And let's take a look at what some of those elements are. Now, I mentioned the use of animals, and you'll notice that throughout the film, animals are used in a way that kind of makes reality feel a little bit weird or off. And what does that do? Well, the use of animals in a kind of surreal way helps bring the realism of the story alive. What are some of those elements? Well, we have the chicken. After the blind man is attacked, there's the blind man, Don Carmelo, who was the blind street musician. And after the boys in the gang and Jaibo's gang beat him up, out of nowhere, he looks up and he sees a chicken there. And you really have to wonder, it's one of those moments where it just kind of passes by and we don't give it a second thought. But this is a pattern that we see time and time again, that animals appear in the strangest of circumstances in a seemingly natural way, but for an inexplicable story reason. So Buñuel uses the sudden unexpectedness of animals to heighten reality and to create a sense of the unreal or the surreal, which he was a master of. Buñuel is most famous for being a surrealist. Buñuel uses animals throughout the film to bring out a sense of truth or reality in a way that is artificial but seems real. Another example of the surreal is Ojitos. If you remember Ojitos, the boy who was abandoned by his father or his father in the opening sequences of the movie, when the boys early in the film are in the barn and they are hungry, Ojitos grabs the goat's teat and begins to suckle on the goat, which is completely surreal. I mean, that is a bizarre image. But again, the use of this bizarre image really heightens how dramatic the boy's need for food is. But on a different level, also his need for love, for maternal. He has to turn to an animal for sustenance. He has to turn to the actual teat of a goat, a female goat, to give him the motherly love, attention, and sustenance that he is not getting because he was abandoned by his father, presumably for reasons of poverty. They just couldn't afford to feed him. So the use of animals and the use of this dramatic, surreal imagery helps highlight story points. We have a shot of a pigeon on a woman's back, which, if you weren't really thinking about it, you would just think, well, he's just using some kind of local folkloric type of medicine. Don Carmelo applying a pigeon to the back of a woman because of the pain in her back. And we get a close up of him rubbing the pigeon up and down. So presumably the pigeon is absorbing all of the negativity, all of the bad energy, all of the painful elements that are causing her harm, and absorbing it into that pigeon. And so that way later they kill the pigeon, and the pigeon presumably becomes a literal scapegoat for our pains. There are other animals, by the way. Most notably, what is the most notable use of an animal? Well, we have the chicken again here, right? You remember this shot, okay? This is pretty dramatic, awful shot where the protagonist is killed, right? The boy that we have grown to care for and at least feel empathy for is killed, and, well, he's in a barn, yeah, but the chicken lands on him. That didn't have to happen that way. Films don't just happen. There is a reason for it because the director deliberately wanted that chicken on the boy's chest. And again, it really brings the scene, this tragic shot, this tragic moment, a new sense, a different sense, a sense of heightened reality, okay? A sense of reality, surreality, which means above or beyond reality. The most important, the most memorable, I should say, moment of surrealism in this film is the very vivid, very scary, and effective dream sequence with its really cloying, but again, very effective sound effects. And that was Pedro's terrifying dream sequence. The critic Saul Austerlitz, as you will read in the readings that I provided to you, points out that this scene exemplifies the rot that lies even at the core of his fantasies. It means even in his unconscious, or perhaps especially in Pedro's unconscious, when he sleeps, when he dreams, even his dreams are being rotted. They are at the core, at his very deepest, darkest, unconscious self. He craves his mother's love. He craves her feeding him and sustaining him, despite her seeming hatred of him. Another visual element of Los Olvidados is the use of fetishism. Now, fetishism is a kind of erotic obsession. It's an erotic obsession. It's when that allows them to express their repressed sexual desires. Buñuel has those. In this scene, we see Mecha, a young girl, pour milk on her legs. We also see Pedro's mother soaping her legs. So we have Meche. Is there a story purpose to watching a young girl pour milk on her legs? No, there isn't. Okay, this is just Buñuel being Buñuel. He wants to include it. Is he a little bit perverted? You be the judge. He also later shows Pedro's mother washing her legs. Who is in the room with her at this time? Jaibo. And Jaibo is in the room. And he sees her. So I think Buñuel is having his cake and eating it too. In other words, he wants to show women's legs for his own personal repressed post-Catholic school reasons. But at the same time, this particular scene shows the story purpose of El Jaibo watching her and being turned on by her. And that has a story purpose later because, of course, he ends up getting together with her. The story itself is a story that reveals the tragic nature, the brutality of poverty, of living in poverty, how being poor is not something that we can fetishize ourselves and say, oh, only the poor will get into heaven, and the poor are so saintly. They sacrifice so much, and we put them up on a pedestal, and yet we allow them to continue to be poor. He's saying, no, being poor is miserable. Being poor is awful. People who are poor do awful things to survive. So that's the story that I talked to you about in the intro to the film. And now we're looking at the visual elements. So in addition to that story, we have surreal elements and we have two major fetishistic elements. And there may be more. If you kind of poke around, you'll notice that there are all kinds of interesting visual cues in the film. And let's take a look at some of those now. So first we have the use of animals here. Another way that Buñuel uses animals. How does he use them? We see in the beginning of the film, before Pedro is completely corrupted by Jaibo, that Pedro loves animals. He really does. And when he's given an opportunity to be around animals, to take care of animals, that he treats them with love. And we see that in the beginning of the film. But then we see that there is a learned cruelty, that this sweet, innocent boy is quickly corrupted and turned into a boy who is obliged to use his cruelty towards animals, and his anger and frustration comes out towards the end of the film when what does he do? He beats a chicken to death. And we see it on the screen. So he kills a chicken at the end of the film, and we see that progression in him from a boy who loves animals to a boy who has learned to be cruel or is forced by circumstance to be cruel. We also see this image, which is also another surreal image, which doesn't contain any animals. But in and of itself, this image of the poor beggar, the disabled beggar on the floor, it's a heartbreaking shot. It really is. It's a very, very difficult shot and sequence to watch of these boys abusing this miserable person. Well, he's not necessarily miserable, but this unfortunate person. And to see a man without half of his body wiggling on the street is almost funny. Okay? It would be so funny if it weren't so tragic. And it's hard, it's to the point where you almost want to laugh just to alleviate the tension and the anxiety of such an awful idea. That this is what these boys are doing to their fellow citizens, to their fellow humans. And this surreal imagery helps exaggerate the reality of the situation. This surreal image, this image of a man with half a body, essentially, is what we're looking at. He didn't have to have a beggar with half a body, but he makes for an easier victim, and he makes for a more memorable idea that these boys are so cruel that they will even abuse a man who is essentially fully disabled. So how did Luis Buñuel feel about neorealism? Because if you'll notice, there are lots of elements between our film and The Bicycle Thieves that really are very similar. They both paint a portrait of the underclass. They both paint a portrait that has an unhappy ending. And they're both made around the same time. Bicycle Thieves in Italy, 1948, and Los Olvidados in Mexico in 1950. Well, Luis Buñuel refused to really acknowledge that neorealism was what he was after. He says, and this is in your reading, neorealist reality, so he's critiquing here movies like The Bicycle Thieves, is incomplete, conventional, and above all, rational. So he sees The Bicycle Thieves as a rational film, which it is. It's a conventional film, but he sees that as incomplete, as not quite capturing what? The poetry, the mystery, all that completes and enlarges tangible reality is utterly lacking. So he sees no sense of mystery. He creates a story that paints a portrait of reality, but what does he do? He incorporates elements of the subconscious, the unconscious. Buñuel says, the cinema seems to have been invented to express the life of the subconscious, yet it is almost never used to do this. So he's doing it. He is, through the use of surrealism, incorporating elements of the subconscious. Pedro's dream, Jaibo's final dream sequence as he's dying, the use of animals, the use of surreal imagery to help make a more realistic image. He thinks that he can more closely approximate a true sense of reality by showing elements of the unconscious. Buñuel seeks to infuse reality with the poetry and the mystery that completes and enlarges reality in Los Olvidados. How does he do it? He uses surreal imagery. Next, I'd like to look at Buñuel's atheism. Now, you'll notice that in the context video and in the readings, Buñuel's atheism is mentioned, and it's an important point, especially when we contrast it with his devout Catholic upbringing. He was raised as a devout Catholic. He went to a Jesuit school, and he rejected Catholicism, but he always had a love-hate relationship with Catholicism. It's an element, it appears in all of his movies. I mean, virtually all of his movies have some connection to priests or bishops or Catholic dogma or elements of Catholicism. If you reject Catholicism, then what do you embrace in its place? And what he appears to have adopted, this is according to me, this is my theory, is that he adopted a philosophical existentialism. And if you look at films like Los Olvidados, what you'll notice that he's saying is that, look, your best intentions, just intentions, or your Catholic faith, and I'm just talking here generally, not you specifically, is not going to help improve the world. It's up to us, ourselves, by doing things that we can improve the world. that we are responsible for making meaning in the world. That according to Buñuel, it is not God or faith that provide meaning, it is we humans who do that. That philosophy is the philosophy of the French theoretician Jean-Paul Sartre. And Buñuel's basic point in films like Los Olvidados, I think, is that good intentions and faith are insufficient. That, so-called liberal democracy and all of these institutions that are set up to help really are not enough. What is the solution? He doesn't really provide a solution, but what he is saying, it's kind of a bleak ending. He doesn't provide a solution. But what he's saying is it's up to us, all of us, the poor as well as the people who are not poor, to make the world a better place. It's not enough, as I mentioned in the intro, to clutch your pearls and be shocked by the poor, or enough to criticize those who don't help them. So he really is pointing fingers at humanity in general and saying this is what we have created and what we have allowed to happen. And this is a response to his denial, his refusal to be a Catholic, or at least a good Catholic. Because the irony is that he never really saw himself as a non-Catholic, more of like a Catholic rebel or a lapsed Catholic. Going back to our images, we have here the dream sequence. And in this image, you can see very clearly here that Chaibo is stealing in the dream the meat, this raw meat, that Chaibo's mother, that Pedro's mother is giving to Pedro, or appears to be giving to him. So this is a really creepy scene, but it's really unforgettable. And it has elements of the Freudian unconscious. All of Pedro's fears and anxieties about his mother's love, about his ability to count on her for sustenance and food, is on clear display here. And what he's really afraid of is who was hiding under his bed is Chaibo. And not only is Chaibo stealing his food, Chaibo ultimately, even ironically, weirdly, steals his mother's love by sleeping with her. Right? So that is a very powerful rebuke of Pedro's need for his mother. So there is, as one of the videos says, an Oedipal significance to this. That Pedro wants his mother all to himself, but another person, another friend of his comes in and literally sleeps with her or steals that love away in a sexual sense. And so you can see here that Buñuel is touching on all kinds of taboos and unconscious Freudian elements. In this shot here, we can see, this is as Chaibo is dying, we can see that the camera is creating a crossfade or a cross dissolve between the dying Chaibo and the images that he sees. And we also hear in the soundtrack, we see here him calling for his mother. And we discover earlier that he's actually an orphan, that he never knew his mother, that his mother died in childbirth. And so this is an example of Buñuel using the cinema to infuse reality with poetry and mystery, to use images from the cinema to express the life of the subconscious, which is basically synonymous with the unconscious. And that he's using poetry and mystery to enlarge reality, because otherwise, as he says, he sees it lacking. That's what he's doing here. That's also what he's doing here. This is the unconscious. This is what's literally going on in the characters' minds. We're looking here at another instance of reality, which is a tragic one, and we see two males, pursue and become sexual predators of a very young girl, Meche. I don't know how old she is. Perhaps she's 12 would be a reasonable guess. And she even carries a knife with her in order to protect herself from precisely this kind of behavior. Initially, it's Chaibo who tries to give her a kiss and basically tries to begin to rape her. And one of the worst things about that is her brother, Cascarito, I think his name is, laughs at it. He basically smiles upon it because Chaibo is the leader of the gang. He doesn't want to go up against him. So he basically gives Chaibo a free pass to almost rape his own sister, to rape Cascarito's sister. That's shocking. And then we see it even worse. We see Don Carmelo, well, it's not even worse, equally worse. We see Don Carmelo begin to do the same thing. A man who we thought, necessarily, we knew that he was cruel in some ways, but he's also a victim in others, is just about to begin to rape or begin to sexually assault Meche when she takes out the knife and she's prepared to stab him to defend herself. Another instance of this harsh reality we can see here in this very unspoken but visually compelling scene, where we see that Pedro is down and out on the streets. He looks basically completely abandoned and homeless. And we see a child predator come up and basically try to buy his sexual affections from Pedro until a policeman comes along and chases this man away, and not a word is said in the entire scene. It's all done visually. You can imagine there that the police showing up was a blessing for the audience more than anything, because it would have been very difficult to see the scene had the child predator actually successfully taken off Pedro. But we know as an audience that that police officer is a contrivance. Okay. What scene does this remind you of? Think about it for a moment. In the Bicycle Thieves market, we see a child predator approach Bruno and do the same thing. So both are unspoken scenes, but we can see in both instances that dark side of reality. Buñuel also points to and mentions Pedro's mother's story. We know that she didn't know the father of Pedro, so that explains in some weird way her lack of affection or ambivalence toward her own son. She was basically raped herself at the age of 14, so we can see the cycle of poverty and violence that is created because Meche is not far from that age herself, and you can imagine that at some point some male is going to successfully assault her, tragically. And so we have empathy for her as well. We have empathy because she has mouths to feed. She has an oldest son whom she didn't want. At the age of 14, she gave birth to him. And so that's a very difficult cross to bear. So here we are at the final slide of our conversation today. And we can see that the ending is indeed bleak. The kids exhibit, as I mentioned earlier, this learned cruelty. And it doesn't get any better. In fact, it ends tragically. We do not have a sense of hope. That's the ending that Buñuel presents us with. It's a sense of hopelessness. He does not seem to want to give us a false sense of, well, it'll be okay in the end. He's saying, no, this is not going to be okay in the end. This is what we are presented with. This is the harsh reality, and he doesn't want to sugarcoat that reality. And the film, therefore, doesn't appear to editorialize. It almost feels like a documentary because he's not taking sides. It's almost as though the camera and Buñuel's eye were impartial. He's not taking sides. He's not criticizing the poor. He's not criticizing the children. He's just pointing out what is, what exists. So the film is unadorned in that way, and it doesn't sentimentalize or turn the poor into some sort of Catholic or Christian sense of heroes. He sees them as brutes, as the context video shows, and the fact that society itself has turned them into these brutes. He doesn't linger on reaction shots to elicit pathos. He doesn't try to milk it for tears. He doesn't give us a chance to cry. He doesn't give us a chance to get mushy and soft and to feel like, oh, she lost her son, right? Which is tragic. But he doesn't want you to feel that way. He wants you to feel angry and frustrated and shocked at the reality instead of making ourselves feel better by lamenting it in an emotional sense. Pauline Kael, the great film critic, says Buñuel creates a sense of moral terror at the tragedy. Moral terror instead of sentiment, instead of weepiness and sadness, and oh, these poor people. He's saying, no, this is outrageous. He says, look at how these poor people are treated by society, and look how they end up being forced to treat each other. And so we get to the end of the film where there is a dark, bitter irony, where Pedro's mother is calling out for her son, where this is where she ultimately redeems herself She knows her son is out there, or she believes him to be out there, and she's looking for him. So this is the ultimate act of maternal love. She's calling out to her child. And the darkest of ironies is there in that the cart that carries him passes by her. Meche and her grandfather take Pedro's body in their cart and literally roll it down a trash hill. They don't even wrap up his body in a bag. They just roll it as if that body were trash. And that is the final shot of the film. That society has basically decided that this boy's life is worth trash. If he chose, Buñuel could have chosen to linger on a shot of the mother's face. We could have seen her close up. We could have held on that shot, and he could have milked the moment for us to feel how painful and awful this moment is. That she maybe suspects, she senses in some sixth sense that her son is around her, her son is nearby, and he's dead on the cart. But Buñuel chooses not to. She does look back for a moment, but it's from a distance, and then the cart goes up to the trash heap and they dump the body. Finally, an alternate ending of the film was actually filmed, and this is what producers will sometimes do just to kind of protect themselves in case for any reason they need to change the ending. They have that option. And so an alternate ending was filmed. I put it in the context video page. How would the meaning of the film have changed if that alternate ending had been used? And that is what I want you to think about, because we know the ending that was used, and that is the one that thankfully Buñuel was allowed to use. That's his vision as the director. An alternate ending was filmed, and that was the one that wasn't used. In fact, it was only discovered, I believe, back in the 1980s or 90s. So that's what I want you to think about. What is the point of the ending that we have? And how does that change? How would that have changed had the other ending had been used? It's a pretty straightforward question. In some ways, I've already provided an answer to you, but what I'd like to see is if you have a better answer. And if you prefer one ending over the other, I'd also like you to add that to the discussion board. All right, everyone. On that note, I'm going to end our presentation today. Bye, everyone.